excited when David told me that Wes Jackson was going to be coming to UC Santa Cruz. I first learned about Wes Jackson's work back in, I think, 1992 or so. I was an undergraduate at the University of Kansas, and someone that Wes also knows, Donald Worster, an environmental historian, told me, you really must know about the work of Wes Jackson. I, at that time, was working in a molecular biology lab, working on the genetics of pigment systems in salamanders. And Wes has his PhD in genetics. You may not know that, or maybe do. He, like me, got a BS in biology, which he might interpret differently than me, the BS part. But
mine was a BA.
Oh, yours is a BA?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, BA. Okay, well, I'm the one who got the BS in biology. He is the BA. Thus, he's been more successful than me. And then went on to get his PhD in genetics at North Carolina State University. Anyway, our overlap was over an interest in genetics, but genetics from a slightly unorthodox perspective. So Wes goes on to, as Donald Worster told me in the story, that he went to California and helped to start one of the first environmental studies programs in the country at in Sacramento, and but decided that, and this is the way Donald Worster put it to me, that academia was a little bit of BS, but maybe not. We heard a little bit of the story yesterday, but decides to go back to Kansas to start the Land Institute, which probably more of you will know about, which was an effort to create a sustainable agriculture. And I don't know how many of you will know about the Dust Bowl. How many people know about the Dust Bowl? Okay. So for people that don't, and Wes, I'd be interested in any of your corrections to this, but my understanding, one way that people talk about the Dust Bowl is that it was the largest human-created environmental disaster that the planet really has ever seen. There have been other really traumatic things that have happened to the planet, but none that have been caused by humans. And what happened was, the short story is the introduction of the tractor, technology, a tractor. It used to be that agriculture was done using only horses and plows that horses drew. Then the introduction of the tractor with a particular type of blade that John Deere developed enabled the cutting through of the sod out in this very dry part of western Kansas is part of it. The Dust Bowl area includes a 5-state region. I'll just focus on the Kansas part. We focus on Kansas. But anyway, digging up the grasslands out there that had never been dug up before, turning them into agricultural lands. And basically the roots from those grasses for millennia had been keeping the soil in place. And once you got rid of those grasses, Kansas is actually the Kansa word for southern wind. The wind blows very hard in this part of the state. 50 miles an hour is not unusual. And so once you've dug up the prairie grasses, you have removed the plants that have served as the roots, literally the anchor of this land, and it resulted in the Dust Bowl. That's one story that one can tell about the Dust Bowl. And so at that time, back in I was just reading a tract from 1940 that the government sponsored a study of Sublet, Kansas, which was in the middle of the Dust Bowl, trying to understand how farmers were, responding to and people living on this land that had been so devastated by the Dust Bowl. And one thing they mentioned is the effort to create perennial wheatgrass, the Russian effort to create perennial wheat. And Wes's the Land Institute that Wes founded back in 1976, its most prominent, I think, success has been in the production of this perennial wheatgrass that was long desired, because it would mean that you didn't have to, continually dig up the land and subject it to the exposure due to wind. That's one of the advantages of it. This is not the only thing that West's Land Institute has done, but it's one thing I just want to highlight. And so anyway, I learned about Wes's Land Institute back in 1992. I went on to, I wasn't interested in wheat or prairie at all until very recently. I went on and did molecular biology. My field was genomics, and but 2 years ago, I got interested again in Kansas and in the prairies, and I was really excited to finally have a chance to meet Wes Jackson. So here we are, and so this is Wes Jackson, who's joining us from the Land Institute, a leader in sustainable, one of the founders, maybe the founder of this whole idea of sustainable agriculture. So we're very, very lucky to have him here with us today. I also want to say briefly that Matt Kearnes is joining us too, who happens to just be visiting us from Australia. He's also working on Prairie. Matt has been arguing to me that Kansas and Australia are basically the same type of land. I don't know, maybe you can...
I think making the argument that the western side of the US and the eastern part of Australia are effectively part of the same country. And the reason I argue that is because we also had our own Dust Bowl experience, partly because we imported a whole bunch of agricultural techniques from the US. And what we gave you back was the eucalyptus trees, which are draining California of their water. And we gave them, and they were imported back to California as a windbreak technology by agriculturalists in the context of the Dust Bowl experience. So the trade of agricultural kind of techniques across these two nations has had dramatic effects in both the landscape here, but also the landscape in Australia too.
Yeah, so it's just kind of a happy convergence actually here. And so what we want to talk about, the topic of our little class today is knowing and caring for prairie. And so without further ado, I just want to get it started, and I'm just going to open it up by asking Wes to, this may sound like an easy question, but it's quite a complicated one in many ways. What is prairie and why should we care about it? So,
yeah.
Thank you, Wes, for being here.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. What is prairie? Prairie is a kind of grassland. And a lot of times they just meld all the grasslands as prairie and treat it in some generic sort of category. But the specificity that I emphasize on about prairiehood is a grassland that features 4 functional groups: warm season grasses, cool season grasses, legumes, and members of the sunflower family. If you are in tallgrass prairie, you have lots of warm season grasses, fewer cool season grasses, but then you'll have the legumes with the biological nitrogen fixation, and then you'll have members of the sunflower family. If you are in a dry area like eastern Colorado, you will have shortgrass prairie, and in between the tallgrass prairie, where there's lots of precipitation, is midgrass. So it's something of a gradation, but a change in the ratio of those 4 functional groups. If you are in Canada, there is lots of cool season grasses and fewer warm season grasses. But you still have the legumes and the members of the sunflower family. So you have this relationship among those functional groups that varies according to temperature, rain, precipitation, and so on. So, and I was telling her last night about an old, very good ecologist that used to be head of the crop lab at Urbana, Illinois, who was also a good ecologist. He said, when asked, how do you tell tall grass prairie from midgrass prairie? Because it's very hard for most novel naturalists. And he said, when you abuse midgrass prairie, it goes to short grass. When you abuse tall grass prairie, it goes to hell. This was Jack Harlan. And what's interesting to me about it is that the sharp distinction among the three comes under stress. And it makes me think of the necessity of an optimum stressor level, which is necessary, as von Rensselaer Potter put it back in about 50 years ago, at all levels of organization, there's an optimum stressor level. At the cell level, the tissue level, the organ level, the organism level, and at the ecosystem level. Within us, if there is too much stress, it's information overload. If there's not enough stress, there's a kind of a boredom, a laziness. And so the prairie is able to, as an ecosystem, as a slab of space-time, is a coherent whole in which you have a sort of a, well, it's a slab of space-time. And I want to emphasize something here that may be useful to you. Well, a Bibleman back in about 1951, or maybe 2 or 3, he wrote a paper on integrating levels. And he started, go up the hierarchy, started with atoms, then molecules, then cells, then tissues, then organs, then organisms, and then he stopped. And ecologists said, what comes next? And J. Stan Rowe, an ecologist in Saskatchewan, said, well, what do those other categories have in common? Some had been saying the next after organism is species. Some said populations. And Stan Rowe said what the others have in common, and by the way, Bibleman had 12 laws of integrative levels. And he said species, what the others have in common is contiguous volume, slabs of space-time. So as you go up that hierarchy, species don't have contiguous volume. Populations don't have contiguous volume. And when they tried to make species and populations a part of that hierarchy of structure, the 12 laws didn't hold. But when you introduce the ecosystem, the slab of space-time, then the 12 laws of integrative levels worked. So, when we see a prairie, we are talking about a slab of space-time, and what comes next is ecosphere. An ecosphere is a slab of space-time, and the ecosphere is not a superorganism, it is a supra-organism. All right, so that kind of provides where prairie sits in that hierarchy of structure. And so when we came across the continent, cutting the forests and plowing the prairies, as Wendell Berry said, we've never known what we were doing because we've never known what we were undoing. And we came with vision, but not with sight. We came with visions of warmer places. We came from Europe as colonizers. We've yet to discover America. Colonizers cannot discover anything. The discovery of America is what we are about now. And I think we got a shot at it, maybe. So, but I want to show, unless you think I've gone on too long.
No, please.
I want to show you the distinction that, yeah, okay, yeah. I might have to turn this over.
Wow. All
Okay,
right.
now let's
well
do it
done.
this way. There we go. This is actual
All
size.
right. Cool. Oh my God.
So the
That's
one at
great.
the top is the wheat plant, and Kansas is the wheat state. And so, and that is the number 2 crop of the planet. Number 1 is rice, number 2 is wheat, number 3 is corn. And so if you take all of the grains, 70% of our calories are grains, growing on about 70% of our acreage, and that's US and worldwide. So what we set out to do in '77 is solve the 10,000-year-old problem of agriculture rather than problems in agriculture. So you can imagine that when the plowshare went across the prairie and cut
Yeah.
right here,
Yeah.
right there,
Right,
that's
right.
carbon. So my view is climate change began 10,000 years ago, when we began to cut the grassland. And by the way, this is intermediate wheatgrass, which comes from the Mediterranean region. But it is like the perennial, many of the perennials of the grassland, the prairie. So
Yeah.
it was back in '77 in which I had the epiphany in looking at the soil erosion data from the General Accounting Office, that and taking my students to the Conza Prairie near Manhattan, Kansas, and thinking no fossil fuel input except the barbed wires out of the Industrial Revolution. No chemical contamination, no human-made chemicals, and no noticeable soil erosion. And yet all around the wheat fields are like this. And so my book, New Roots for Agriculture, is about the attempt to build an agriculture based on the ecosystem concept, that slab of space-time. So we can put
What does
this
it
down.
say? What does it say at the end there? I can't see it. Oh, the Land Institute. Okay, yeah, this is great.
We can just lay this down.
Okay, cool. All right.
People
It's really
frequently want to come up
amazing.
later and kiss
I want one
it.
of these. Do you bring one that we can have?
Yeah, well, we sell those.
Yeah,
We got
we'll
a
buy-
special price today.
Well, all right, excellent. All right, we want one. We're gonna get one of these.
Yeah.
Because
Anyway,
it does
that's
a
the-
wonderful job of demonstrating something that I think people don't appreciate, which is that most of these grasses live underground. That this is and that once you like plowed them up, you've really done a number, because it took a long time to get these roots. How long to get those roots that long?
That's about 14 months.
Here.
No,
This
This-
one
this-
here is 14 months.
yeah. Oh, well, this
Oh.
one here, you
This-
see, is in the ground. You plant the seed in September, late September. You harvest in June. You got to tear the ground up again. See, so, you know, it's a Johnny come lately.
Yeah, what are the names of these two?
Well, this is wheat.
Yeah.
This is the very species that started civilization.
Okay.
This is the kind of species that'll save it.
And what is it?
That is what we call Kearnes.
Oh, that's your Kearnes,
After,
okay.
but
Okay.
the
Okay, this is your
it's,
perennial
it's,
grass.
it's intermediate wheatgrass that we've domesticated, and the way we got into that is that I was wanting to cross it with this,
Uh-huh.
the wild form, in order to get perennialism in this. I wanted
Oh.
perennialism from that,
Yeah,
and the yield from this.
yeah.
Well, the problem is, in order to
Mm.
overcome what we call yield lag, we bred, but turned this over, we hired a young PhD that took this on and to do those hybrids.
Mhm.
And he was getting such response to selection for yield in this, in the perennial,
Mhm.
that we pulled him off the wheat perennial and hired Xuan Wang, and now Li Han went ahead and developed that as a grain. So
As
that's the
grain, so
first
it's not-
perennial grain in the history of humanity, and it's the oldest perennial. It's the last time we had a new perennial was 4,200 years ago, and that was corn.
Wow, wow, okay.
So, this is a winner in two ways. And Xuan Wang is now making perennial wheat. That is, we call Kearnes after Colonel, Kansa Indians, Kansas, and so on.
Okay, yeah, so we want to talk much more about that, but yeah, go
Can I just
ahead.
ask, do they taste the same?
What's that?
Does the wheat?
No, they don't taste the same. First of all, the Kearnes
Yeah.
is low in gluten. Now, we have the genes, we think. We're selecting for more gluten. So what you do is, well, there's gonna be beer. We got beer.
Actually, you got beer, yeah, we got the beer here, hold on.
Yeah, Laureate.
That's what he means by saving civilization.
Yeah.
Send civilization through beer.
Yeah,
I'm hoping to try it tomorrow. Matt
Yeah.
just told me where I can get it in LA.
Well,
yeah.
we've got 2 cases of it in my fridge back.
Oh, you do?
Oh.
We're
Oh,
gonna,
so after
we're gonna
this, we're
surprise,
going
we're
over.
gonna surprise everybody at the Friday reception.
Oh,
So
okay.
we'll be there.
Yeah.
Maybe I can get a pre-taste.
Yeah, in
drink.
general-
Everybody who is of age, that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a lot of farmers working on this.
A lot of farmers working on.
Yeah, they're actually
that are-
growing it
that are
out.
growing it
They're
out.
selling it for huge prices.
And they're taking it up on their farm.
On their farms.
Yeah.
We've worked the deal out with somebody else that'll take care of all that business part, because our breeders don't want to have to be dealing with, the business part of all of this.
Interesting, yeah.
And so on. So it's called plow, P-L-O-U-D or something like that.
Is the business part?
Yeah, it's a kind of what they do is have help nonprofits be able to be more self-sustaining.
It's P-L-O.
P-L-O-U-H, I think.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's, something like, it's not
Yeah.
P-L-O-W anyway.
So let's, huh? So let's go back, because I don't want to skip too far forward, because we want to come back to this. And Matt, you should jump in too when you want to. But
Yeah.
on the question of.
By the way, it's growing in Australia.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It is?
Yeah.
Through Kansas?
Yeah, it's on all the continents.
It's on all the continents at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah,
When
no,
did-
perennials are on all, there are other species that we got that we're working on, like sorghum.
Yeah.
And then we've been supporting the perennial rice in China, and there are thousands of acres of that now.
Yeah.
That's another story.
Yeah. I want to take us back, actually, just a little bit. We'll come back to the Land Institute. But
Now, I want to say one
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, you
If
say
we
one thing.
stop with perennial monocultures, we missed half the point.
Yeah.
It's the ecosystem. And this is my problem with, it's not a problem. Most sustainable ag has to do only with the crop. And now, my friend Steve Gleasman, who is here, he has worked to get species growing together and get the efficiencies that are inherent with the natural integrities. But, so
Right.
but there are a lot of folks that are looking at this as a perennial wheat. Well, it's only one of the membership because our goal is all 4 functional groups in our slab of space-time. Yeah.
Right, because your focus has not just been on this wheat, but on sustainable agriculture, which
Yeah.
means a sustainable natural system.
Right.
Which means you have to think about not just the plants, but also the species that go along with the plants.
Right.
And I want to get into that.
Yeah.
But I want to go back just for a minute to think about the history of the prairies and who cared about them and why they cared about them. And, long time ago, our early environmentalists were painters. And George Catlin painted the prairies. This is one of his paintings from the 1840s. And there's been if you could actually argue that the proposal that we ought to preserve the prairie goes as far back as Catlin, who worried about the loss of these ecosystems now, however many, 170 years ago. And in Kansas, which I guess I sort of mentioned I grew up in, and there's a part of Kansas called Chase County. Now this is the part of Kansas with the tall grass prairies. And you get more rain in this part of Kansas than you do in the western parts. And I want to come to some of these distinctions between these different types of prairie later. But the point being that there's been an over 100-year debate of whether or not the United States should create a tall grass prairie park, whether or not we should preserve it. And there were lots of, and it really, I don't know the full history of this, but it really intensified in the 1950s, and there were lots of discussions about where it should be sited, and eventually people decided on this one part of Kansas. But there were intense debates, and these were happening when I was an undergraduate, about whether or not there ought to be a tall grass prairie park. In the early days, there were arguments over whether or not Yellowstone should be the archetypal, national, landscape. We all think of Yellowstone as, and also Yosemite, for those of us here in California, as being those parts of the country that we ought to save, that all citizens should have the chance to appreciate. But there were another group of people who said, no, those are weird, landscapes. The archetypical, landscape of America is the prairie, and we ought to preserve the prairie. And in the late 80s, early 90s, this really got intensified in Kansas, but there was a lot of opposition to the tall grass prairie park. And Wes, I wanted to just ask you to reflect on, why we should care about the prairie, and to give us some insights over to why anyone would have opposed the idea. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I said, why would anyone oppose the idea of having a tall grass prairie park? It seems, it's just some grass, like what could be wrong with preserving some grass? Now herein lies a very complicated story, but I would be interested, Wes, if you wanted to give us some reflections.
Yeah, well, we need wilderness, generally, as a standard against which to judge our agricultural practices. Agriculture, in a broad general sense, is inherently destructive. And here's a hard one for folks. Soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. And a lot of the high yields that we get on the small scale are the result of what I call acceptable theft. But if you get at soil genesis, then you begin to see that what's required for the renewability of nutrients running down is geologic activity. And I'm going to deal with your question more precisely.
Okay.
I'll tell you just a quick story. Mendocino County, California. There are 5 terraces. The Pacific plate is sliding under the continental plate. about every 100,000 years. And so, right in, let's say, Terrace 2, you have redwood and Doug fir. In Terrace 3 is a transition zone, and in Terrace 4 and 5 is pygmy forest. You do your soil probes, and you will find in the area where the biomass is high, the redwood and Doug fir, there is rich nutrients as a consequence of that uplift. Where there is pygmy forest, it's been natural ecosystem for 500,000 years, but the nutrients have been going down. Gravity has a hold of them. Question, why are not pygmy forests, pygmy prairies, whatever, all over the world? Because we have geologic activity. The Coast Range created our valleys. The Sierra Nevada created our valleys. The Pleistocene gave us the most favorable expansive agricultural land by scraping nutrients off the Canadian shield and giving us Iowa and Illinois and so on. That's what feeds us. Australia is a poor continent, and it's going to stay poor. Because its last geologic activity was 65 million years ago. This is what makes soil as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. It requires geologic time to be making things. Now, you come back to prairie.
Yeah.
Prairie roots are holding the ecological capital for a food supply of the future. And so there was probably 6% carbon to 8% carbon in our soils. We're down to 2 and 3. So this was the beginning of climate change. And it's also here was a system in which biological nitrogen fixation, which is not trivial, because the most important invention of the 20th century from a existentialist point of view for human existence was in 1909. Two Germans, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, learned how to turn atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. Without that, Vaclav's mill is calculated right now, 40% of humanity wouldn't be here. And what's the feedstock? It's natural gas. Is the feedstock for anhydrous ammonia. Now, let me tell you what the association in those roots, in that slab of space-time of the prairie, is biological nitrogen fixation, and the way that works is with the rhizobia, which is anaerobic, which means operates in the absence of oxygen. The root will attach to the bacterium, form a little house around it, and inside that, this is extra large here, inside that, it will then, in an oxygen-free environment, at ambient temperatures, and 4/5 of 4/5 of an atmosphere, using 21 enzymes, do what the industrial chemists do at 350 degrees C and 400 atmospheres. So this represents an important point for our future. You can have an energy-intensive system, but it will come at the drawdown of the capital stock. Or you can have an information-intensive system, which is like those 21 enzymes. I'm using that as a placeholder. So What does the prairie have to offer? That prairie has answers to questions we've yet learned to ask. We have not learned to ask the questions that it has answers to. So that's the story. That is a longer answer than you wanted, but
No,
yeah.
not yet.
Yeah. So look, I have nothing against Australia. You can't help it.
I've got lots of things against Australia. But your answer kind of raises some really interesting sort of, features of the field. So we talk a little bit about saving prairie, but you're also in the business of restoring prairie.
That's right.
And so I wanted to talk to you about what the
Yeah.
difference between saving and restoring. And in
Yeah.
particular, you talked about, you had a kind of functional understanding of restoration. So it's about restoring these four functional, grass.
Well, they're not, two grasses, a legume, and a sunflower.
Yeah, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, about what restoration means.
Well, all right, I'll have to say that my daughter, who is an ecologist and is at University of Northern Iowa, and she is head of the Tall Grass Prairie Center, and they are devoted to restoration. So what her research with her graduate students has been to learn how to establish what we call the forbs, the broad season, or the broadleaf plants, the forbs, to a restored system. For instance, she just acquired an 80-acre farm that had been farmed for over 100 years, and there's another 80 at 100 that's coming. And they're going to turn that back into prairie, but that is restoration. Now, saving the prairie that's already there, of course, is where the real information comes. I mean, we have 2 trucks that are devoted to taking soil samples, where you open up the gate, you drop down a tube, and you pound it in, and you pull it out, and you get a big long thing, and then you take that to the soils lab, and you find out what's the story with our prairie that we have. We have a lot of prairie that's never been plowed. In fact, we have bison on our prairie. And we have prairie that's been established. And then we have our cropland. So now we have these side-by-side comparisons of the kind of dynamics that you can expect under what we'll call the most pure system. And by the way, through all interglacial periods of the Pleistocene in Kansas, it has been prairie. Some of the interglacial periods of the Pleistocene in Iowa become woods.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that's where, so it's somehow related to precipitation. So, does that answer your question?
I guess what I'm trying to get to is when you're thinking about restoration, are you thinking about taking things back to something that mirrors the more pristine form of prairie, or are you thinking more functionally about?
Well, we want to eat,
Yeah.
and we want grains, and humans are primarily grass seed eaters and secondarily legume seed eaters. And I think it has something to do with our life in the upper Paleolithic on the African savanna that makes us compatible with grains. But so no, we want grains. So well, here just to tell you a little story. Several years ago, when I'd go around to the colleges and universities and talk about an agriculture based on the ecosystem as the conceptual tool, then the obvious thing was, how are you going to plant a polyculture? How are you going to harvest it? And so, for a 2-year period involving 8 acres, we took corn, was that maize? That's a warm season grass. We took sorghum, which is also a warm season grass. We took soybean, which is a legume, and sunflower. We did not have a cool season grass in there, in the mix. And we planted them all with an air drill. And in a ratio that is similar to the ratio of those functional groups on the prairie, that hadn't been plowed. And then with a combine, we opened up the concave on the combine, cut the air so we wouldn't blow the sunflower seeds out the back, and harvested this instant granola. And then we separated the seeds with a seed cleaner. Now, that is we were wanting to mimic the structure in order to be granted the function. However, all of those were annuals. You see, so the structure is not perfect. But in terms of the functional grouphood, it was close. So the goal is to, and now we are putting together Kearnes with various legumes. And Patagonia is supporting that work. In fact, they gave us a nice grant to continue that work. So, the standard though, I'll just tell you one other story. My friend Jack Ewell, working in Costa Rica, where tropical rainforest, and there they have slash and burn, but there get to be more people now, and so the burning is more frequent. You slash, you burn, and then you let it go and it comes back. So Jack went in with his graduate students, quite a team. He was at the University of Florida at the time. And they substituted plants in there that were analogs of the surrounding wild. So they substituted vine for vine, tree for tree, shrub for shrub. But they did not use anything that had come from there, but they were from somewhere else, but analogs of. And he came up with one of the most wonderful phrases. We mimicked the structure and mostly were granted the function. Tight nutrient cycle. And get to all of the metrics we look for in agronomic systems. So that's, to me, this is not in the same category of my friends working in the area of sustainable agriculture, which are mostly not grains. They're working on what I call the health component. And that's the local, organic, community-supported system, but it is not as predicated on the, what we might call the purity of the ecosystem concept. You see what I mean? I mean, yes, we got to have that. That's why, we're all one. But the scale is almost always smaller than when you're dealing with grains, and which are the 70%. Yeah.
Well, I feel like I finally have an opportunity to sort of ask you to expand on the complexity of, and I'm going to use this bad word, genetically engineering polyculture. And I guess part of I had the good pleasure to be able to talk to you a little bit about this earlier, and I just wonder, when the breeding is species-centric, how do you handle the complexity of the future of that species in its polycultural environment?
Yeah.
Doesn't it need to change its root systems to be compatible with the roots of the legumes that are supposed to grow alongside it? And somewhere buried in my question is an invitation for you to comment on the difference between traditional breeding and genetic modification as we understand it
Yeah.
in the industrial sense.
Yeah. Well, by the way, that first question is our most worrisome question, because I'll make a confession about what geneticists want to do. I know the feeling. What you want to do, because the reason we had a good green revolution is we developed good statistical models. know, it was, most of those yields were a better knowledge of Fisherian statistics. All right, so what you want to do, if you are a breeder, is be able to elbow out conflicting realities.
Yeah.
Now, Tim Cruz, who went to school here, with Steve Policeman, and as our director of research.
He's
yeah.
the director of research now.
Yeah, he's good. He's a really good ecologist. He did his postdoc at Stanford with the 2 Cs. Tim Cruz is really on to this problem of getting the breeders to at least think about the breeding within context. And of course, breeders got too many things to worry about. One is they don't want to see their population crash. Because they're out of the problem of the insects, pathogens, and weeds. I think we're just going to have to run that experiment, but here's the way we are being careful. With the Kearnes, Lee D. Hahn has several lines that he is developing independently of one another. And by the way, I'll just tell you this wonderfully interesting story that serves as a validation of that method. In bacteria, I can't remember the bacterium, E. coli maybe, they had, I think it was 10 different, I'll say petri dishes of bacteria, all subjected to streptomycin. And they kept those colonies going for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, they found, of course, there's streptomycin resistance, but through 10 different metabolic pathways. In other words, to get to Chicago, you can get there in 10 different ways. There is your destination, but in the selection, it does not follow the same. So that's what we're doing as a way of protecting the variation until we get the assembly of all together. So, now you had a second part of that question.
Well, no, I mean, not necessarily. It was just the issue of breeding versus genetic engineering.
Oh yeah, the
what
genetic
things
engineering.
can
Look,
are.
genetic engineering is so limp-wristed. I mean, too much fuss has been made about it, for one thing. Another, it is really for the monocultural mind. It is an emphasis on human cleverness, rather than this is an emphasis on nature's wisdom. And we start with the idea, I start with the idea, there is no gene for perennialism. Perennialism is a way of life. And, you know, it's one of those things when I am alone by myself, I know what a gene is. But when somebody asks me what a gene is, I can't tell. You know, it used to be that we could say, but because of the nature of interactions, because of, you know, methylation and all that stuff that we've learned in the last 20 years,
Yeah.
you know, the story is so different now.
Yeah.
It's no longer beamed, what do we call it?
Beanbag genetics.
Beanbag genetics in
Right.
the same sense, you know.
Right, this is that, yeah.
Yeah, so.
But this has been the debate that's gone on in genetics since, you know,
Yeah.
between Dobzhansky and the
Yeah.
population geneticists and the classical geneticists going back to the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
It's an old.
It's an old thing, but the way we dealt with it after Mendel for too many decades was to treat those things as anomalies.
Mhm.
But what Thomas Kuhn told us in the structure of the scientific revolution is when your anomalies pile up, you get a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift doesn't have to do with a new logo for Coke. You know, it's a fundamental thing.
So I actually want to ask you, Wes, about, I want to bring this back to Kansas and how this plays out in
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
Because what you just said, you get a paradigm shift, but who gets the paradigm shift? And I want to ask you because, our farmers go, you say you've got farmers playing the field. Farmers, just to say a little bit about this for people who don't know, I want to return back, this is a photo from 1961, the National Park Service, part of the advertisement for creating a tall grass prairie park in Kansas. But another image I want to show you is this one, which is the confrontation in 1961 between Carl Bellinger and Secretary of Interior Stuart Woodall, who, this made national news in 1961, where the story, at least, I don't know, the backstory is that these government folks from DC landed in their helicopter, literally, you can see, on this twin mounds here in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and this rancher was there, and the story I've read is with a gun, which might be, maybe because he's sticking out, and this looks like they're going to get along, but the story you read is that these people wanted those folks to leave. You can see that this person doesn't really look like they're from here. They came in a helicopter, they're wearing a suit. And there's been this, and then I'll show one more, which is this. Keep the grasslands free, no government acquisition. So there was real opposition to the Tallgrass Prairie Park, which in large part was about ownership of land. It was about the worry that the national government was going to take tens of thousands of acres out of, say, property tax, be able to have local property taxes going back to the people so that they can control how their schools will run. The way the land is owned and operated and who's on it, who owns it, has been quite contentious in this part of the country, which is known for being the home of the pioneering American who came to a part of the country that supposedly no one was supposed to be able to attain. In 1800, people got to the Mississippi and looked out beyond it where the tree line ended and said, it's going to be another 50 years. No one's ever going to be able to live in this part of America. It's a great American desert, is how it was described. And yet you have people come in the 1850s and start homesteading this land, and it becomes an American tale of real success, and a lot of money is made off of agriculture in Kansas. It has been the historically, or I'm sorry, not historically, but it became a very important source of the production of wheat and cattle, both in this country and also during World War I, for example, and World War II. And so there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of contestations that you wouldn't necessarily think about, and it's not just a story of genetics, it's a story of people and the land.
Right.
And so I want to bring the people into the story a little bit and have you tell us a little bit about your relationships to farmers around this question. Do you think they will go through a paradigm shift along with you and plant the perennial grasses, and how that's changed over time? You've been doing this for over 40 years. A lot has changed in that time. I wonder if you can reflect on your relationship with farmers in Kansas and how they've accepted you or not accepted you, and your relationship to ecologists.
Well, I have the advantage of having been raised on a farm.
Yeah.
And so my brothers, farmers, parents, farmers back as far as you can go. I grew up in the Kansas River Valley near Topeka. My great-grandfather came into Kansas in 1854 and homesteaded even before it was a state.
Yeah.
He settled on Indian land, not knowing it, Native American land.
Yeah.
I know the talk in the sale barns. I can butcher chickens, hogs, or a cow, and I can drive tractors and combines and so on. So I know the language. if you know the language, you know how to avoid conversations that aren't going to go anywhere. If you have enough respect, you will be paid attention to a certain point. But I have to tell you that when it came down to Nixon or Kennedy, I broke from the family and voted for Kennedy. Now, it took a while for the relatives and friends to get over that. You know, because our whole ethic was predicated on the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. And not only that, Ike is from Kansas.
Yeah. Right.
Not only that, Ike and my mom are first cousins.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, so what are we gonna do, you know? So, but this is a way of saying, though, that it comes down to, being able to negotiate the reality. And I have to tell you, I made big mistakes back in the early 60s when I went to the Kansas legislature in favor of saving the tall grass prairie.
Oh, you win as part of this.
Oh yeah, I will tell you, I've been insulted more than almost anybody by those committees. You know, this was way back, you know. So I was too young, and probably too full of myself, and also too eager to enjoy my anger. You know how that goes, maybe when you're young. So this is, I think, not only just a problem between, say, farmers and, well, there's a problem between farmers and ranchers.
That's right. That's right.
And and this goes back to Genesis. And well, I mean, this is true. It's the Cain and Abel problem.
Oh, really?
And this is not a Johnny-come-lately thing we're dealing with here. Something fundamental about that. And God favored, guess what? The meat eater. You know? And you can see what happened to the meat eater. He gets the hatchet right there or something. So, you're asking an old question, you know, an old problem.
Yeah.
And this is getting a little risky maybe, but I think that the East Coast and the West Coast that treat our part of the country as flyover country were blindsided on what was going on. And we have lost our many small towns and rural communities, and we have now in Kansas counties in which the courthouse square has no business around them. And I can show you poverty. And at the same time, we have this, in a sense, we have been blindsided by the success of the local organic community supported folk in places like Marin County and up the Hudson. You see, and those where we have these conferences and sustainable ag folk come together, and we have the wonderful gardens of Chadwick and so on. Meanwhile,
Right.
what about the 70% of the calories that support you?
Yeah.
See?
Right.
And so that message is put out there in subtle ways, and a certain kind of proper and self-righteousness, and along with it goes the right kind of coffee and
That's
the
right.
right kind of beer.
And wine.
And what?
Wine.
And wine. Yeah, the coffee, the beer, and the wine. And there's a tendency for humans to create a class system. And we're in the midst of creating a huge class system. We're already into it very deeply, and that's why people don't understand Trump.
Yeah. So I don't think I said this, but Wes knows this, but I'm actually biking across Kansas, talking to farmers and ranchers about how to know and care for the prairie. And one thing
About what?
how to know and care for the prairie. And I started doing this right after Trump got elected. And partly it was to try to understand what was going on in my own home state. And Strong City, I think, is a great example, a beautiful, beautiful town, but boarded up, and it's probably doing better than a lot of places. But the population decline in these towns has been quite drastic. My best friend from college, lives on her family farm. Very, very difficult for her. They lost the struggle that they had to keep the school in their. Her father was a school teacher, taught at Dwight Elementary, and she fought to keep that school open, and it was closed, and now she has to drive her kids 45-hour to Manhattan to go to school. It's very, very difficult to live not in cities in Kansas. One thing I think people, and biking across Kansas, you learn things like, people laughed at me in Laureates. They're like, what the hell are you doing? Like, biking out in the middle of Kansas, you're going to get killed. And I said, how? Why? It was 60 trucks going 60 miles an hour on gravel roads. So I was going down Avenue J, which is the avenue that all these, it's like A, B, C, D, F, and then numbers. And they're gravel roads, like the one you saw at the beginning. And big rocks. Angela told me, don't go down Avenue J, worst graded road in the county. Big old rocks. I was wondering what it meant, but it means big rocks. I was going top 6 to 7 miles an hour on this road. And later, Uncle D was taking me down Avenue J, and he said, I really do hope that the Stover's food truck doesn't come. We've been trying to tell that guy that he needs to slow down. So at about 3:30 in the afternoon, the Stover's food truck comes through going about 60 miles an hour. And I'm thinking, if I was going 6 miles an hour on my bike and going over this little rise, there's no way I would have survived that encounter. And the Stover's food truck, and then it made me think, why is the Stover's food truck going down these roads in Kansas? Well, it's because, and I asked Angela this too, who lives out here? A lot of it is, there's two things going on. One, you can buy a house, for $20,000. So people who are poor will end up buying homes out here. And two, many people are not growing their food that they eat on these farms. And there are no longer grocery stores in these towns. So how do you get your food? You go online and you order frozen food from the Stover's food truck. And that's why the Stover's food truck is going 60 miles an hour down gravel roads in Kansas, creating a new hazard. So the plains continue to be dangerous, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
And this goes to your point.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, back in the 90s, I went into Matfield Green, Kansas.
Beautiful place.
No, it's a beautiful, beautiful place.
Yeah.
Population 56. And I went to the courthouse in Cottonwood Falls. And I came away owning 5 properties for a total of $2,200.
Really?
We bought the school in Matfield Green
Did you?
for $5,000.
Really?
Yeah, that was built in the 30s. And we had, in fact, we hosted conferences. There were 5 of us bought it. We put in, there were 4 of us. Worcester was in on this.
Really?
Yeah. We put in, we divided it up by 5.
In the school.
To buy the school. And then I had, my nephew bought the bank. And he owns the bank yet for $1,000. He bought it.
Wow.
So this will just tell you what's happened.
Right.
There's a, now the problem is it's 100 miles from the Land Institute.
Yeah.
We had
I know,
conference.
because I'm thinking about biking from there. No ways, yeah.
But I wanted to, at that time, we were in the midst of what we called the Sunshine Farm at the Land Institute, which was to You know, we had a biodiesel tractor, we had draft animals, we had chickens, we had up to 70 head of longhorn cattle, and the energy that fell on the farm had to pay all the bills. So Marty Bender, in charge of the project, went all the way back to the mining legal in the Minnesota Iron Range to build a biodiesel tractor, to processing it year in, and it's a huge, huge accounting problem. All right, so I want to do the same thing for that town. Treat that town as a slab of space-time and see what the dynamics are within and what's coming through that boundary. Well, we had a graduate student from the University of Illinois on that. But just to say that we gave up on that project. We did finish the 10-year Sunshine Farm study. The problem is that the nearest town where you can get groceries is 40 miles
That's
from
right.
Matfield Green.
That's right. Yeah.
And Matfield Green
Right.
is a quarry to be mined by others.
And a food desert.
And it's,
What do
well,
you mean by that? What do you mean by
well,
others?
the railroad, Santa Fe Railroad goes right through there.
That's right, yeah.
All right,
Right.
now why aren't they collecting taxes on that? There's a highway that does go through, and the people that live there have jobs at $10 an hour. If they're working for a rancher, less than that,
Yeah.
because the rancher will give them a place to live. But the old people still have gardens, but the old people die off.
Yeah.
And now we've got the drugs, the meth.
That's right. That's
So
right.
this is what's
That's right.
happening to those
That's
little
right.
towns, is
Yeah.
that people move away to eastern Kansas, to Johnson County, where you grew up, and they move there, or they move to Lawrence, which is the only county in the state that votes Democrat.
Yeah, the little blue bubble.
And meanwhile, you get the meth people coming in,
Yeah.
and so it's like Appalachian.
Yeah.
And it's because of what Wendell Berry referred to as the surplus people problem. And so the economy, there's a fundamental law, I think it's the law. Highly dense energy destroys cultural and biological information.
Interesting.
In other words, it's a result of the 4 billion year old imperative that we are carbon based and we go after it. And we do not have exercise restraint. So we keep
Yeah.
blaming
Yeah.
ourselves that we're not
Yeah.
good enough Methodists or Catholics or whatever. But I think it's what I call an unconscious polity. The spirochete will go to the light or a food source, and we do. And then we build policy later to account for what we do. So that is so I think the war against the rainforest and the plowing of things, well, Carl Sauer was onto this up at Berkeley back in the 30s. Carl Sauer said if it were not for the grasslands, we would not have had an industrial revolution.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much
We've
time.
got like 5 minutes, and I don't know if there's
Yeah.
burning questions out here, and
Yeah.
anything back.
I wanted to maybe
Yeah, we'll get.
bring some of this together, I guess, because you started with this incredible sense that folks here are only just learning what it means to settle America. Only just recognizing or reckoning with the colonial experience, and we are in Australia doing that too.
Yeah.
But you're also talking. We also talked about perennial wheat, and then we've come back around to people and community, and really to questions of justice. What does it mean to think about environmental justice in the context in which you're working? And I'd love, I guess, you to paint us a picture of how we should be thinking about the post-colonial kind of context, the context of incredible kind of agricultural disruption, but also the prospects for a just future. What does that look like I'd love to get a basic picture of that.
Well, if we're gonna have social justice, we gotta know more than we know now about what's going on across the country. And right now, it's ignored, denigrated, whatever. It isn't just Appalachia. You know, it's the Midwest. How is it that the great state of Iowa, that has the best soils of the state,
You mean of the nation?
I'm sorry, of the nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably of the world, you know, I mean, as far as a big area. How is it that they can't keep their young there?
Right.
How is it that they're dumping nitrogen into their agricultural land, causing the city of Des Moines, for instance, to have spent $25 million to take the nitrogen out of the water? How is it that when you come into, go into Colorado and you go into a motel, there will be a sign there that says, "Do not drink the water," because of the nitrogen? And we just drive on by right on 70, and oh, there's bottled water. They'll see to it you got some bottled water in your room. I mean, where the hell are we as a people? As a people. This, by the way, is one reason I am studying the exile of the Jews into Babylon. I'm looking for the patterns. How is it that a people gets ignored, and what has been the compensatory engagement of folk that are effectively in the process of the making of a people, but exile. I'll just look for patterns. There may not be. There may not be. But I think I'm trying to get a grip on how is it that we just continue to allow this to happen. And we elect senators that don't even live there, really. I mean, yeah, they got a little place. And you go in, and well, of course, and my daughter, by the way, nailed this in an essay she wrote many years ago. She says it's the Stockholm Syndrome problem. That those who are caught within the system know that the only way that they can survive have to have bought into the system, as Patty Hearst did. In other words, the only way for Patty Hearst to live was to join the Lebanese Liberation Army, the Stockholm, and that's how she was defended from the Stockholm Syndrome. And that there is a kind of unconscious adopting of the system, you see, rather than raising our voices. And
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
try to get a conversation on MSNBC or CNN. Don't worry about Fox News. You know, try to get a conversation, or NPR, or public television about the Wendell in 1977, Wendell Berry, The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture, and he intended for that to be prophetic, and it ended up being, corrective, and it ended up being prophetic. Because the unsettling of people leaving, and the unsettling of a country.
Yeah. One of the things that Donald Worster said to me, Donald Worster is the environmental historian who told me about Wes Jackson's work. He asked me, "Jenny, what is home?" And I don't know. He said, you know, Jenny, they teach kids how to leave home these days, but not how to make one. And you know, I left Kansas. I was part of what you're talking about. I'm now concerned about all of these issues you're talking about. How do you have these cities like Emporia that used to be such vigorous towns, home of William Allen White, one of our great journalists, American journalists, who wrote the original essay, What's the Matter with Kansas? And now you have these boarded up,
Yeah.
you know, beautiful buildings. It's a freezing cold day in Emporia. somebody else biking.
When I was living in Matfield Green is when I wrote Becoming Native
Oh,
to this place.
really?
And,
Oh, interesting,
and
yeah. Yeah, right.
well, anyway, I interrupted you, but I said in that book, there's only one major in the university. It's upward mobility. And what we need is a homecoming major where we educate people to go to some place and dig in. They don't have to go back to their home, but to dig in and then allow the upper Paleolithic hangover in the creation of community out of tribal world to get the kind of group interaction that will make us more politically powerful. So, yeah. But now there is a college in the country that has a homecoming major. It's Sterling College up in Vermont.
Oh, yeah, I mentioned that, yeah. Well, I think, I know there's lots of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them. We had a bit of a late start, but I think that's a good, actually, place to end. Maybe Wes, if you'd be willing to stick around for a few minutes if
Oh, sure.
people had questions. But I just want to thank Wes for coming out to California.